Outcry as Shanghai sends vulnerable senior citizens into makeshift quarantine camp. See moment Shanghai resident confront the police over COVID tactics. CNN. The man came after 2 a.m. on Tuesday in the dead of the night, banging on the apartment door in the run-down housing complex in Shanghai. When nobody answered, they pried open the lock and barged in, losing the 92-year-old woman from her bed. The visitors demanded to take the woman and her 74-year-old son to the quarantine center because, according to their record, both had tested positive for COVID-19 5 days earlier on April 14. When the older woman refused to go, both she and her son had since tested negative. She was allegedly pulled out of bed and dragged onto the floor. Fearing the worst, her son helped her dress and agreed to comply. The account of the event, as told in the series of online posts by the woman's granddaughter, Ji Ye, a former journalist born and raised in Shanghai, has sparked shock and fury across the Chinese social media. There is no limit to the cold-blooded cruelty and violence, said the top comment under Ji's post on Weibo, China's Twitter-like platform. Amid public outcry, the local government issued a statement on Tuesday evening confirming the late-night transfer of the two elderly residents to the quarantine site. He said police and neighborhood committed workers had a locksmith pry open an outer door to the apartment because they feared an accident had happened to each occupant. The statement said the two elderly residents had agreed to the transfer after communicating with the police officers and violently went downstairs to get in the car. Ji declined to be interviewed when reached by CNN. Ji's grandmother is among many senior Shanghai citizens who have been hauled off to government quarantine in recent days as authorities step up effort to remove all positive cases from communities in a bid to end the spread of the COVID outside the designated site. On social media, some residents have called for help as their elderly parents or grandparents were taken into isolation facilities, sometimes without the medicine or equipment they need. A patient in a quarantine center converted from a warehouse told CNN a group of senior citizens, some in wheelchairs, was transported to his facility from a nursing home on Monday night. Some senior citizens have attempted to push back. Several social media videos show an elderly woman who appears to have left quarantine and is trying to enter a neighborhood compound. She is seen walking around and arguing with COVID workers in hazmat suit, who tried to persuade her to go back to the government facility. CNN has reached out to the local officials for comment about the situation, but they have not responded to calls. The mass transfer came as Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan, the most senior official in charge of the country's COVID response, vowed Monday to send anyone who tested positive for COVID and their close contact to quarantine site, without exception, deduction, and delay. Sun said in the interview Saturday that community transmission in Shanghai could be expected to end soon and cases would only be detected in quarantine centers. Shanghai officials were under tremendous pressure to contain a raging Omicron outbreak, which has infected more than 430,000 people despite weeks of stringent mandatory home lockdown. Public discontent have been mounting, with residents struggling to secure food and medical access. Latest efforts to end community transmission have only sparked more anger. Many fear that senior citizens will not receive the proper care at makeshift isolation facilities, some of which are plagued by poor conditions, overcrowding, as well as shortages of medical equipment, doctors, and nurses. For the elderly and in their 80s and 90s, the risk of them getting cross-infected and dying in these quarantine centers is much higher than having them staying at home and self-isolate, said Yan Zhonghuang, a senior fellow for global health at the Council of Foreign Relations. Many of those elderly people suffer from chronic conditions that require special care, which likely would be provided at quarantine centers. Chinese officials have long boasted that zero COVID is saving lives, especially vulnerable groups like the elderly. But some argue that by forcing senior citizens into centralized quarantine, it poses a threat to the health and well-being of the very people the policy is supposed to protect. The quarantine is at what cost? And does the end justify the means? Huang said. A man lives in the temporary hospital for people infected with COVID in Shanghai on April 19. Dave Pride opened the door. In her social media post, Ji said her grandmother and uncle tested positive for COVID-19 by anti-self-test on April 13. They immediately informed the neighborhood committee, which sent workers to take their nucleic acid test the next day. Both developed only mild cough and had no fever, and by April 16, their antigen test had returned a negative result. Then, on Monday afternoon, they were told by the neighborhood committee they would be transported to the makeshift quarantine facility. She was immediately worried. Her grandmother suffers from the high blood pressure and heart disease, while her uncle is on daily medication for the recent prostate surgery. Like many other Shanghai residents, Ji resorted to social media for help. Please, everyone help me share this. Please don't take my 94-year-old grandmother to the quarantine center, she pleaded in the lengthy post on WeChat, which went viral. Traditionally, Chinese age is calculated differently and can add up to 2 years to the person's actual age. Then, at 2:47 a.m., she received a brief phone call from her uncle. Dave Fried opened the door. She heard him saying, his voice barely audible above the noise. When Ji's grandmother and uncle arrived at the isolation facility after 4 a.m. on Tuesday, it was already crowded with elderly people, including some in wheelchairs. Ji wrote in a later post. There was no free bed available, and they spent the rest of the night sitting in the hallway. The next morning, they were assigned to their beds and each received a sleeping bag and a blanket. A video of the healthcare center obtained by CNN shows senior citizens lying or sitting on beds lining a hallway and the reception area, with wooden boards and thin sheet as bedding. An elderly man who could hardly walk is seen clinging onto a wall as he moves in slow, tiny steps toward his bed. The local government statement said medical workers at the quarantine center conducted a Beijing medical checkup on Ji's grandmother and uncle and make sure their health conditions are normal. It acknowledged the shortage of beds and said health workers would pay extra attention to elderly patients with underlying ailment. The public attention appears to pay off. Shortly before midnight Thursday, 45 hours after they were taken away, Ji's grandmother and uncle were sent back home following 3 negative COVID tests. Ji wrote in an update on WeChat, "I hope grandma and uncle can finally have a good night's sleep without being disturbed again," she wrote. But many more senior citizens remain in centralized quarantine or are likely on their way there as the campaign to end the community transmission intensifies. On Wednesday, Sun, the vice premier, told the local officials to come up with more targeted measures to deal with all the neighborhoods and nursing homes that have reported high infections. Officials were told to strengthen on-site contact tracing, speed up the transfer of positive cases and close contact into isolation, and swiftly conduct disinfection. High infection and conduct disinfection, according to a statement from the Shanghai government.